I want you to think about the very last moment before you fall asleep. That warm, heavy darkness when the world goes quiet. No notifications. No voices. Just your own breathing and the soft sound of a house settling into the night. Now imagine that silence being shattered, every single night, at exactly 3:03 a.m. Not 3 o'clock. Not 3:05. Not a random creak or a neighbor's car. 3:03. On the dot. Like a clock had been set somewhere in the dark, and whatever was on the other side of the door had been waiting, patiently, deliberately, for that precise moment. This is not a ghost story. I want to be clear about that right now. What I'm about to tell you is something that happened to me, something I lived through, something that changed every single thing I believed about my family, about secrets, and about the kind of love that refuses to stay buried. And by the time I'm done, I think you'll agree that the truth turned out to be far more haunting than any ghost ever could be. My name is Mara Ellen Solis, and I moved into my grandmother's house on the 3rd of October, which, looking back, feels like the universe already trying to tell me something. My grandmother, Neela, had passed away 2 months before. She was 81 years old, small and sharp as a pin, with silver hair she kept pinned back so tight it made her eyes look slightly startled. She smelled of lavender and talcum powder and something older underneath, something I could never quite name. She was the kind of woman who had lived through things she never talked about. Wars, migrations, losses so old they had calcified into silences. I had loved her. I want that on record before anything else. I loved her the way you love someone who is already a little bit legend in your mind. She left me the house because I was the only one in the family who'd stayed close. My mother had moved to Vancouver years before I was born. My uncle Dario lived in Madrid and called on Christmas if he remembered. There were cousins I barely knew the names of. But me, I had lived 40 minutes from Neela my whole adult life. I had visited every other Sunday. I had been there when she got the diagnosis. I had been there at the end. So the house came to me. A 3-story building on a quiet street in a small town in northern Spain, tucked between a bakery and a pharmacy, with green shutters that needed painting and a garden in the back that had been losing its battle with the weeds for at least a decade. I was 34, newly separated from a man I'd spent 6 years trying to love correctly, and I had nothing keeping me anywhere. The house felt like something I was supposed to do. I moved in on a Saturday. I spent the first week unpacking boxes and eating takeout and walking through rooms that still held the shape of her reading chair, her ceramic dishes, her small television always tuned too loud. I slept in the guest room because I couldn't bring myself to sleep in her bed. Not yet. The first night it happened, I thought I was dreaming. There was a knock at the front door. Slow, deliberate, 3 knocks, then a pause, then 2 more. Not frantic, not soft, just intentional. I lay in bed for a moment, heart hammering, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Then I checked my phone. 3:03 a.m. I didn't answer. I told myself it was kids, or a drunk neighbor, or someone with the wrong address. I pulled the blanket over my shoulders and eventually, somehow, I went back to sleep. The second night, I was already half awake, and when the knocks came, at exactly 3:03 a.m., something cold crawled up the back of my neck. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 more. The same pattern. The same unhurried rhythm, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world and simply knew I would eventually come to the door. I went to the window. I looked down at the front step. There was no one there. By the end of the first week, I had established a ritual I was not proud of. I would set an alarm for 2:55 a.m., sit up in bed, and wait. And every single night, at 3:03, the knocks would come. And every single night, when I ran to the window, the street below was empty and quiet and completely still, as if the dark itself had swallowed whoever had been there. I called my friend Celia after the 7th night. Celia was a nurse, deeply practical, with zero patience for what she called atmospheric thinking. She came over on a Tuesday evening with a bottle of wine and the specific energy of someone about to debunk a haunting. "Old houses make sounds," she said, pouring generous glasses for both of us at Nella's kitchen table. "Pipes expand, wood settles, your brain is in grief, it fills in patterns where there aren't any. Celia, it's 3 exact knocks, a pause, and 2 more. Every night. At 3:03, she looked at me steadily. How much have you been sleeping? Not enough. Obviously. Mara. She put her hand over mine. You watched your grandmother die 2 months ago. You left a marriage. You moved into a house full of her things. Your nervous system is running on fumes and memory. Give yourself some grace. I wanted to believe her. But I also knew what I had heard. On the 10th night, I finally did something different. Instead of going to the window, I went to the stairs. I crept down to the ground floor in the dark, heart beating so hard I could feel it in my teeth, and I stood in the front hallway with my hand on the door handle. The knock came at 3:03, exactly as always. 3. Pause. 2. I threw the door open. Nothing. The street was empty. The air was cold and smelled of damp stone and night. A cat somewhere in the distance made a sound like a complaint. The nearest street lamp cast a pale circle of light onto the cobblestones, and there was no shadow in it. No footprints. No retreating figure. Nothing. I stood there in my socks and my grandmother's old dressing gown for a long moment, and then I noticed something I had missed every other time I'd looked from the window above. There was a letter tucked under the brass doormat. Not an envelope. Just a single folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, creased as though it had been folded and unfolded many times before. I picked it up with hands that were not entirely steady and carried it inside. I sat at the kitchen table under the overhead light and unfolded it. The handwriting was my grandmother's. I know it the way you know something that lives in your body, the particular slant of her letters, the way she made her capital M with a little curl at the top, the old-fashioned formality of her penmanship. She had written this letter. But the paper was old. This was not something written recently. The ink had the faded, slightly blurred quality of something that had spent years tucked away somewhere dark and dry. It read, "If you are reading this, then I did not have the courage to tell you myself. I am sorry for that. There are things a person carries for so long that they become part of the weight of being alive, and you forget that the weight was ever something you chose to pick up. Go to the cellar. Behind the wine rack, there is a wooden box. Inside that box is the beginning of what I owe you. Forgive me, my love, Neela." I read it 4 times. Then I sat very still for a while. Then I went to the cellar. My grandmother's cellar was exactly what you'd expect from an 81-year-old woman who had grown up in the aftermath of scarcity. Shelves of preserved goods, old bottles of oil and vinegar, a wine rack along the far wall with a dozen dusty bottles that had probably been there since before I was born. I moved the wine rack. It scraped against the stone floor with a sound that seemed enormous in the silence. Behind it, set into a shallow alcove I had never noticed, because I had never had reason to look, was a wooden box about the size of a shoebox, bound shut with a length of old twine. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, bound in 3 separate bundles. And underneath the letters, a photograph. The photograph showed a young woman I recognized as Neela. She must have been in her late 20s, luminous in the way that photographs from that era make people look, all high contrast and serious expression. She was standing beside a man I did not recognize. He was tall, with dark eyes and the kind of face that seemed built for intensity. They were not touching, but the way they stood, angled toward each other, a barely perceptible lean, said everything words would have been too careful to say. On the back of the photograph, in Nella's handwriting, October 1968. The last good day. I took the box upstairs. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table under the overhead light, and I began to read. The letters were from him. His name was Tomas. Tomas Vega. He wrote in a dense, beautiful script, the kind of handwriting that tells you a person learned it from someone who took language seriously. The letters were dated between 1965 and 1971, and they told a story I had never been given any piece of. He and Neela had met in Madrid when they were both young. She was studying to be a seamstress, he was finishing a degree in civil engineering. They had fallen in love with the kind of completeness that you can only feel when you are young enough to believe love is a permanent state rather than a continuous choice. They had been together for 4 years. They had planned a life. And then something had happened. Something that the letters danced around rather than stated directly, the way letters do when both people writing them already know what the something is and don't need to name it. What I could gather, reading between the lines, was that Nella's family had intervened. Her father, my great-grandfather, a man I had only ever known as a stern face in an even older photograph, had decided that Tomas was not acceptable. And in the language of the letters, not acceptable seemed to be connected to where Tomas came from. to his family's history, to something that made him an outsider in eyes that saw the world in a very particular and narrow way. Neela had been made to end it. She had written him a letter, the only one of hers in the box, and it was not the original but a copy she had made in her own hand, as if she needed to preserve the evidence of what she had been forced to do. In it, she told him that she was sorry. That she had loved him with everything she had. That she was doing what her family required and that she would carry the weight of it for the rest of her life. She did not tell him she had stopped loving him. She was very careful about that. He had written back once after that. Just once. His final letter was short. It said, "I will keep your name. Not the one you were born with, I mean the name I gave you the first night we were ever alone together. The name I will say every night before I sleep until there are no more nights left for me. You know the one. Take care of yourself, Neela. Take care of whatever it is they make you do instead." I put the letter down. I was crying, and I had not noticed the moment it started. My grandmother had married my grandfather, a man named Aurelio Solis, the following year. By all accounts it had been a decent marriage. Not passionate, but steady. They had raised 2 children, one of whom was my mother. My grandfather had died when I was 12, a quiet man with a hearing aid and a fondness for chess who I had never seen fight with or deeply embrace my grandmother. Now I understood, with the particular clarity of things seen from the outside, that he had probably known. That some part of him had always known he was the person she had chosen instead, not chosen above. I stayed up until sunrise reading every letter. Then I went back to the photograph. Then I went to Nella's bedroom, her actual bedroom, which I still hadn't moved into, and I sat on the edge of her bed and I thought about the weight of things. She had kept those letters for 50 years. She had kept that photograph. She had built a box around them and hidden it behind a wine rack in a cellar, and she had carried this entire other life that had been taken from her, through a marriage, through motherhood, through grandmotherhood, through 8 decades of ordinary extraordinary days. She had never told my mother. She had never told me. And now, somehow, from somewhere on the other side of a door I could not see, she had found a way to make sure I found them. That was when the real question arrived, the one that had been waiting politely at the back of my mind since the very first knock. Who had been leaving the letters? Because the one I had found under the doormat was not decades old. The paper was yellowed, yes. But the folding was recent. Someone had placed it there. Someone was leaving me notes in my dead grandmother's handwriting. I called my uncle Dario that morning. He answered on the 3rd ring, sleepy and slightly irritable in the way of someone who was not expecting a family emergency before noon on a Wednesday. "Dario," I said, "did you know about Tomas Vega?" A long silence. "Mara, did you know?" Another silence, shorter this time. "How did you find out?" Something dropped in my stomach. You knew and you never." "Neela told me," he said. "She told me when she was diagnosed. She said she'd been waiting her whole life to tell someone and she couldn't die carrying it alone. She made me promise not to tell your mother." "Why not my mother?" He exhaled slowly. "Because your mother would have made it about herself. You know how she is. Neela wanted someone to just hold it for her. Bear witness. She needed that. And you didn't think to tell me after she passed. You didn't think I might." I stopped. I was gripping the phone very hard. "There are letters, Dario. Dozens of letters. Someone has been delivering them to the front door. Every night at 3:03 in the morning." The silence this time had a different texture. Heavier. "What do you mean someone's been delivering them?" "The letters were in the house. Not all of them. One was under the doormat this morning. Written in Nella's handwriting." I waited. "Dario, is there something else you need to tell me?" He came to see me 2 days later. Drove the 8 hours from Madrid without a hotel, arriving mid-afternoon looking crumpled and older than I remembered, with the particular expression of a man who has been rehearsing something the whole journey and still isn't sure how to start. We sat in Nella's kitchen. It was still Nella's kitchen in my head. I couldn't seem to claim it as mine, and he told me the rest of it. Tomas Vega had not disappeared after Neela ended things. He had moved away from Madrid, yes, eventually to a small town not far from where Neela herself had settled after her marriage, as if some current in the world kept nudging them toward the same coordinates. He had never married. He had built a career, a quiet life, a garden he was apparently very proud of. He had never, as far as Dario knew, stopped loving her. Neela had known he was nearby. She had known for decades. She had never contacted him. But she had thought about him every day. Dario said this not with sentiment but with the plain weight of someone repeating a fact, every day for 50 years. When she was dying, she had made one request of Dario. There was a man, she said. She gave him Tomas's name and the town where he lived. She wanted Dario to find him and tell him that she had always, she had apparently said this word twice, loved him. That was all. She didn't want a conversation, a meeting, a reconciliation. She just wanted him to know. Dario had found Tomas. He was 83 years old. He lived in a small yellow house with a garden. When Dario told him, he had sat very still for a very long time, and then he had said, I knew. I always knew. I just needed to hear it once. My uncle thought that was the end of it. But Tomas had asked one more thing. He wanted to know if Neela had left anything behind. Anything she'd written. Any trace of her that he might hold. Dario, who loved his mother and perhaps wasn't thinking clearly in his own grief, had told him about the box. Had told him there were letters, his own letters, which meant he already knew what was in them. And a photograph, and a copy of the letter Neela had been made to write. And he had told him where the box was hidden. Tomas had asked for just one thing in return. He asked Dario to let him know when the house had a new occupant. When someone who loved Neela was living there. He said he wanted to do something, he didn't explain what, and he wanted to do it properly, when the right person was present to receive it. Dario had told him when I moved in. I sat across from my uncle and absorbed this information. Outside, the October light was doing something amber and final through the kitchen window. He's been coming to the door, I said. It wasn't a question anymore. He's 83 years old, Dario said, as if that explained both the impulse and the strangeness of it. And 303. Dario's jaw moved slightly. The first time they were ever alone. Their first date, I think. She told me the story. They'd been at a gathering with friends, and somehow they ended up on a balcony together past midnight, and by the time they'd finished talking, it was 3 in the morning. She said that was the moment she knew. She'd written about it in the copy of her letter. Did you read that part? I thought back. She had written something about a balcony. About the sky turning that particular shade of blue that exists only in the hour before dawn. I had read it and moved on, because I hadn't known yet that it was a key. He's been knocking and leaving, I said. He doesn't want to be seen. He's just, I stopped. He's saying goodbye. He's been saying goodbye. Dario looked at the table. He's not well, Mara. His heart. He told me he didn't have much time and he wanted the house to know he remembered her. I know that sounds. It doesn't sound strange, I said. It sounds like someone who loved someone for 60 years and needed to do something with that. I made my decision before Dario even finished his tea. I found the address easily enough. The small yellow house, the garden Dario had mentioned, a street name Tomas had let slip in his final letter to Neela, which I was now certain hadn't been coincidental. He had wanted to be findable, someday, by someone who would bother to look. I drove there on a Thursday morning, in the last of the autumn color, the hills around the town doing something theatrical with golden rust. I rang the bell of the yellow house and waited, and after a long enough moment that I started to worry, the door opened. He was small, older than I had pictured. He had a cane and white hair and eyes that were still, unmistakably, the intense dark eyes from the photograph, that quality of looking at you as if he was genuinely interested in what was happening inside you. He wore a cardigan over a collared shirt, which felt exactly right. He looked at me and he said nothing for a moment. Then, you have her eyes. Not the color, the way they hold still when they're thinking. I'm Mara, I said. Nella's granddaughter. I know who you are, he said. Come in. We sat in his living room, which was full of books and had a window that looked onto the garden, bare now in November, but you could see it had been loved. He made coffee with the careful deliberateness of someone for whom the act of making coffee was a form of respect toward a guest. We sat for a while before either of us spoke about anything real. Then I said, I found the box. Good, he said simply. I read all of the letters. He looked at his coffee cup. I wrote them to her. I didn't write them for anyone else to read. I know. I'm sorry. Don't be. He was quiet for a moment. She kept them. All this time, she kept them. He said it like he was still adjusting to the fact of it, like it was new information that needed time to settle into the right place. She kept the photograph too, I said. The one from October 1968. Something moved across his face, a ripple of grief so old it had become almost serene. The last good day, he said softly, and I understood that he had written those words on the back of that photograph himself, a long time ago, when he was a young man trying to hold on to something that had already been decided for him. She loved you, I said. My uncle told you, I know. But I wanted to say it in person because I think it deserved to be said by someone who lived in that house with her, someone who watched her every other Sunday for years. She was a woman with something private at her center. Something she didn't share. And I think that thing was you. He didn't respond immediately. He looked at the garden. His hands on the arms of his chair were the hands of someone very old, but they were not shaking. She was the most alive person I ever met, he said finally. And then she wasn't in my life anymore, and everything became slightly less vivid. Not terrible. Just less. Like when you turn down the brightness on something and you tell yourself you prefer it that way. We sat together for another 2 hours. He told me stories about her I had never heard, her laugh, the way she argued about everything with a directness that was unusual for the time, a trip they had taken to the coast and the particular hotel they'd stayed at that apparently served the best clams either of them ever ate. He told them the way a person tells stories about someone they have been keeping alive inside themselves for 60 years, with the specific vividness of things that have been preserved. I told him about her in return, the Neela I had known. The woman with the lavender smell and the sharp eyes. The too loud television. The garden she'd lost to the weeds. He listened with the full attention of someone receiving something precious. Before I left, I took something from my bag. It was the photograph. I had thought a long time about whether to bring it, and I had decided that he had more right to it than I did. I held it out to him. He looked at it for a long time. He didn't take it immediately. Then, with both hands, the way you hold something fragile or sacred, he did. October 1968, he said. The last good day, I said. He looked up at me. And whatever was in his expression in that moment was not sadness exactly, it was something more complete than sadness, something that had sadness in it but also gratitude and grace and a kind of peace that takes a very long time and a very great deal of living to arrive at. Not the last, he said quietly. Today was also good. I drove home through the golden rust of those November hills, and I cried for most of the way, not with grief, exactly, but with the feeling that comes when something that has been hidden for too long finally gets brought into the light. That feeling is not simple. It contains loss and love and anger and tenderness all at once, and I let all of it come, because I thought my grandmother had probably spent decades not letting it come, and someone in the family owed the feeling some honest attention. That night I moved my things into her bedroom. I made her bed mine for the first time. I lay in it in the dark and listened to the house and thought about the weight of things people carry quietly through long lives. About how love, when it's real, doesn't disappear, it just finds different shapes to exist in. Letters, boxes, photographs, 3 knocks, a pause, and 2 more on a door in the dead of the night. At 3:03 a.m., I lay awake. No knock came. I think I had known it wouldn't. He had done what he needed to do, and so had she, and so, in whatever small way I was capable of, had I. But I stayed awake until 3:05 anyway, just to be sure. Just to hold the silence the way you hold something that was always precious, that you only recently learned to recognize. Tomas Vega passed away 11 weeks later, in January, peacefully, at home, with his garden outside the window under a thin layer of snow. Dario called to tell me. I sat for a while after hanging up the phone, not doing anything in particular, just being in the house that Neela had left me. The house that had brought us all to this strange, beautiful, heartbreaking conclusion. I still live there. I painted the shutters. The garden is a work in progress. And sometimes, in the small hours of the night, when the house is quiet and the street is still and the darkness outside has that particular quality it gets just before the sky begins to turn, I think about a balcony in 1968, and 2 young people talking until 3 in the morning, and the precise moment when one of them knew. I think about what it means to love someone across 50 years of silence. I think about what it takes to carry something that heavy and still function, still bake bread and raise children and water a garden and smile at your granddaughter every other Sunday. And I think about the knock at the door. 3. Pause. 2. The rhythm of something that refused to stay quiet. The sound of a love that had waited long enough. Some things knock because they need to be let in. Some things knock because they need you to finally understand that they were always, always there. If this story moved you the way it moved me to tell it, please give it a like. It's a small thing, but it helps more people find stories like this one. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. We tell stories about real human lives, about the things people hide and carry and eventually, sometimes, release. Leave me a comment below. I want to know, have you ever discovered something about someone you loved, after they were gone, that changed how you understood them? Tell me. I read every single one. Until next time, take care of the people you love. Tell them the things that feel too heavy to say. Trust me. Don't wait until you need someone to knock on a door in the middle of the night to say it for you.